In this video, I want to return to the question of moral responsibility and how that relates to free will and determinism. Remember, at the beginning of this module, I wanted you to think about to what extent we could hold a person morally responsible for their actions if it turns out that they could not do otherwise than what they in fact do. This was the principle of alternative possibilities. And if it's true that we live in an entirely deterministic universe, then it looks like you could not have done otherwise. Hence, the principle of alternative possibilities might be false. Of course, the compatibilist would be fine with that, because compatibilism says that we can hold people morally responsible even if it turns out that they could not have done otherwise, if they couldn't have chosen anything other than what they in fact did choose. And that's because all we need in order to hold a person morally accountable, in order to praise or to blame them for their actions, is that their actions originated from a desire that was theirs. Now, for this video, I want you to think about, are we really ultimately responsible for our desires? Because if our desires are not caused by us, if it turns out that your greatest desire at a moment of choice is the result of something outside of you that's entirely independent of you, something you're not responsible for, then it's not clear that we can, in fact, hold a person morally responsible for their actions. And so you can think about this video as a kind of response to or objection to compatibilism. Another way of thinking about that is maybe we can't hold a person morally responsible. Maybe it's going to turn out that incompatibilism is true after all. That is, if our desires are not determined by us, then we cannot hold people morally responsible. So that's the issue we're going to look at now. Now, the argument comes from a philosopher named Galen Strawson, who's actually at University of Texas, Austin. Galen Strawson's argument is really interesting because it returns to the question of nature versus nurture, which we saw and thought about previously. So let's take a look at Strawson's argument. The first premise says, in order to be ultimately responsible for what we do, we have to be ultimately responsible for who we are. That is, we have to be ultimately responsible for the person we are, for the kind of person we are, right? The individual you happen to be. Of course, the second premise is going to say, we are not ultimately responsible for who we are as an individual or as a person. And that's because we're not ultimately responsible for our biology or our genes. That is, we're not responsible for the kind of nature that we have. I couldn't choose to be anything other than a human, right? I couldn't choose to be a dog, for example. I couldn't choose to fly, even if I really wanted to, because it's just not a part of my biology. I don't have the genes required to be able to fly. Likewise, I'm not responsible for the environment I was raised in. I didn't choose my parents or the society I grew up in. I didn't choose any of that. So this argument concludes by claiming we are not ultimately responsible for what we do. And if we're not ultimately responsible for what we do, it looks like we can't really hold people morally accountable for their actions. And intuitively, that just seems highly problematic. But maybe there's a way to respond to this argument. Maybe we could respond by saying, it's just not clear what Strawson means by ultimately responsible. What degree of responsibility is going to count as being ultimately responsible? So think about a situation, one that we talked about previously, where somebody puts a gun to my head and says, I want you to rob the bank. Now, I don't want to rob the bank. It's not something I desire to do. Nonetheless, I will rob the bank because I don't want to die. And we probably would not hold me morally responsible for robbing the bank because I didn't have a choice, or at least my choices were very limited in this situation. So you might say that I'm not ultimately responsible for robbing the bank because I didn't really have many options available to me. Nonetheless, if I did rob the bank, it was me who went in, it was me who collected the money. So you might think I'm slightly or somewhat, to some degree, responsible, even if I'm not ultimately responsible. So it's not exactly clear how we should understand what Strawson means here by ultimately responsible. Nonetheless, I think it's probably fairly charitable to interpret him as saying we need to be fundamentally the reason or the cause for who we are or what we do, right? We need to be the best or final cause or final explanation for the kind of person we are, what we do, for or in order to hold a person morally responsible for their actions. Now, another way to object to this argument is to claim, look, I may not be ultimately responsible for my biology or the society that I was raised in or the parents that I have. Nonetheless, I'm still responsible for some of the things I do. For instance, when I was 18, I chose to go to KU as an undergraduate student rather than University of Missouri. And when I made that choice, I was 18, so I was plausibly an adult at that time. Or, for instance, I decided to get married in my 20s and I decided to raise my child in Kansas City. So you might think that these are choices that I made, they were within my control. However, it's not immediately clear whether that's a good objection to this argument, because you could imagine Strawson responding to this sort of objection by saying, well, the reason why I decided to go to the University of Kansas instead of the University of Missouri was because of the way I was raised, because of the area, the geographical location, and the parents that I had. Right. So I didn't choose to grow up in Kansas City. I didn't choose parents that enjoyed watching KU basketball. I didn't choose these sort of things. So at least as far as the things that led up to that choice when I was 18, I was not responsible for that. Likewise, regarding deciding to get married in my 20s and raising my child in Kansas City, you might think that the reason why I decided to do those things was because I was raised in Kansas City and I didn't choose where I was going to be raised. And I wanted to stay close to my family. Again, my family lives in Kansas City. And so that's something outside of my choice, something I'm not responsible for. And so even though it does seem correct to say that later on as an adult, we can make choices, and these seem as if they're choices we make that we're responsible for. Nonetheless, the choices we make as an adult is directly related to what we did as a child. And if we're not responsible for our biology or our genes or the environment in which we grew up in, then it's not clear that we can be responsible for the choices we make later on as an adult either. So these are the sort of things that I want you to think about as we continue. Now, for this module, your questions are going to be slightly different. I want you to consider what your view of free will is. What do you think about the relationship between free will and determinism? Do you think that free will is compatible with determinism or not? Does free will require some form of determinism? Maybe you think that moral responsibility requires determinism is true. These are the things I want you to consider because you need to take a position. I want you to take a position and defend it. That's what you need to do for the assignment this week. In fact, that's the only question you have for this module.